Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Sweden, from the Jersey Shore of the U.S. Eastern Seaboard. And Peter, I'm not even sure where you are at. Do let us know. Uh,
Washington, D.C.
there. We used to be neighbors for many years. Which part of town are you in?
Alexandria, it's a suburb just south of the city proper.
Well, I know that very well indeed. We lived up in Maryland in Bethesda for 36 years, so we were often down in Alexandria. They have a splendid Cretan Greek restaurant there, as I recall. I hope they're still going strong.
If there is, I'm not aware of it, unfortunately.
Well, I recommend it very warmly. Now, you, of course, are here to throw urgent light, genuinely urgent light for our audience on uh, the Russian and Slavic perspective of the world. As you know, living in Washington all too well, and as I learned there over my decades too, there is an extraordinarily willful ignorance that there does not have to be about Russian and Eastern European experiences of the world, the needs of the Russian, for that matter, also Belarusian, Ukrainian peoples in reality, as opposed to the many myths and lies that are widely circulated and the hysteria that has circulated. Education, facts, history are urgently needed, and we know you're going to provide it. Where would you like to start?
There's a couple different places we could start. One, we could start off with the historiographical basis of a lot of the issues. There's a substantial decline in funding for Slavic studies in the 1990s, and from the 1990s until the revival of interest in Russia after the seizure of Crimea in 2014, the generation of Slavicists that was the last generation of Slavicists, which was trained at the end of the Cold War, really starts dying off. So there's fewer and fewer of them, and they're being displaced around the United States and to a lesser extent other Western countries by these area studies programs, which replace the older Slavic studies programs and are not they're more based around agitation and funded on the basis of their success in intra-university intrigues rather than in academic production.
Now, this is fascinating to me because what you are doing here is giving a sociological basis for changes in political and strategic and even diplomatic perspectives. Is that a reasonable assessment?
Yes.
Please explore it further because it seems to me this is a totally unknown region as far as media discussion and public awareness goes.
Sure. So in the United States, there's really three main types of universities. The first type is the private universities on the East Coast, which are very well established, very prestigious, very expensive. Those are like the Ivy League schools, and as well as some in the South, such as William and Mary. They were established way back in the 18th century or maybe even 17th century. They tend to train a lot of like the U.S. elites. Georgetown University, for instance, was founded by the Catholic Jesuit order in Washington, D.C., tends to punch well above its weight in, how many of its graduates go on to join the United States' diplomatic service and the State Department, whether as political appointees who make the political decisions or staff it as foreign service officers or in other positions. The second tier of universities, these are the state universities. They were funded by the Republic. They were created by the Republican Party during and after the Civil War. They were kind of designed to be the colonies, for lack of a better description, of the Republican Party in all the different states, both the like Republican core in the North and the Midwest, as well as in the new Western states that were added following the Civil War, and in the Southern states as they were reconstructed following the Civil War. And a lot of those programs, they receive most of their funding from the state governments. They're controlled by the state governments, but they do get a lot of funding from the federal government as well for research priorities. And those land grant universities is what they're called. They, beginning in really the 1930s and accelerating during the Cold War, received a lot of funding, not just for scientific research, for the training of engineers, but also in area studies programs. So you have certain universities like University of Indiana that actually has a very extensive Central Asian studies program. So you can learn like Chagatai
Yeah.
Turkic in Indiana, which is a state in the Midwest, for you guys who aren't aware. It's not a place where you'd expect to learn a lot about the fairly unknown countries of Central Asia in the middle of the United States. And that was done very deliberately by the United States government, which wanted to cultivate a lot of these different area studies programs, just so it could have, you know, redundancy, redundant sources of experts for different regions in administering our Cold War operations. The third tier of the universities is mostly private Christian universities, and those they do play some role in our foreign affairs. They, Brigham Young University being a very important one, um, they tend to have fairly low academic standards, but they would train missionaries to go out to uh, the third world, but also the second and first world, to kind of like proselytize Christianity and try to convert various peoples to Christianity. Um, Brigham Young is the most famous of these. It's still active. The Mormons, their church only really started to decline in 2008 in the aftermath, rather than in the 1960s, like most other denominations. So their, area studies programs, are in a much newer state of decay than a lot of these other programs. So we have these three sets of programs, and they are upstream of all knowledge in the United States. You do have people that go out, they become Egyptologists or sinologists or, Slavologists, whatever, because they're interested in art, because they're interested in literature, language, or, sometimes less ethical studies, even back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But it's these area studies programs in these three different types of universities that provide most of the knowledge and systematize most of the knowledge within the United States. These universities, they develop close ties with the think tanks, which start developing in the 1950s and 1960s as private enterprises that are independent of the political burdens of the university system. They're funded predominantly by donors rather than by tax dollars, which in theory makes them more independent, but in practice actually made them more dependent, um, more politicized with time, although they do retain some certain advantages. So the universities, they also produce the books that the journalists read, that various popular writers read to make their case to decision makers. So there's kind of two main really, I would say three main paths of influence. So the first one is just upstream. Universities produce knowledge. That knowledge is read by the decision makers or by the journalists who transmit it to the decision makers. The second is, and this is predominantly through the Christian schools, they transmit the knowledge to church leaders and to business leaders who are interested in religion, who lobby the politicians to enact their policies as they see fit. This is particularly noticeable in our Middle Eastern policy. It's not nearly as common in our Eastern European policy, although you do see there are some Protestant groups which have been active in Russia and Ukraine that have taken an interest in the Russia-Ukraine war and were interested in the region for that. And then the third method of influence is you do have some of these, um, area studies professors who they were either influential people, like in and of themselves, when they were living, in the Middle East and, um, Eastern Europe and East Asia, who they have direct personal contacts with people in their home regions, as well as in Washington, D.C., or the relevant institutions in the United States. And they can make an influence, they're influential on the basis of that. It's like Alexander Kerensky, he was very briefly the leader of Russia in 1917. He was actually a professor, I think, for 20 or 30 years in New York.
Well, um, so is your point is that this institutional knowledge is failing, is becoming not serving America's interests anymore because there's a lack of expertise. It's become politicized. I mean, what I know is that I don't know where you stand on the Ukraine war issue, but in Britain, at least, I think that institutions have become much more Ukrainianized and taken a strong anti-Russian stance and bigging up Ukraine's importance. And I and the Russian experts nearly to a man seem to really dislike Russia, you know. And I don't, I'm not. I had friends who studied Russian. I know some Russia experts, but it's. I mean, and among British journalists, there's no one who likes Russia. They all hate Russia. The only one I can think of who vaguely likes Russia is Mary Dejevsky, who's an independent correspondent. But everyone else. So I mean, it seems to distort decision making. I mean, there's an American called the University of St Andrews in the UK called Philip Brown, I think, and he's incredibly propagandistic. The Department of War Studies in the UK is full of MI6 types assets and so on, and they always pour out. And not only do they hate Russia, I think they're wrong on the progress of the war, and you wonder if it's propaganda. Lawrence Friedman's very famous. He was the one who told Blair to go to war in Iraq. He was always at Tony Blair's side, you know, in the run up to the war, along with Richard Dearlove, that terrible trio, and they traveled around and he fed him basically lies. And now he's saying the same thing. He's doing the same thing for this Labour government. Do you see that sort of thing happening in the US? Is that your point?
It's different in the United States. The intelligence services aren't nearly as active in our civil society as they are in the United Kingdom civil society. There was a decent amount of CIA influence. Like the CIA actually ran a publishing house here in the United States from the 1950s until I think 1975. And one of the things they liked doing actually was they would publish a lot of the literature that was written about Eastern Europe at the time. They wanted to make sure, you know, whether it was pro-Soviet Union, anti-Soviet Union, or orthogonal to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, they were involved in knowing these writers and understanding the discourse and exerting their own particular kind of influence over it. There's actually a huge scandal. Well, it was part of a much broader scandal that came up in the Church Committee in 1975 or 1976, where the Senate came back and said that, you know, the CIA, FBI, NSA, they're far too influential. You guys can no longer play this kind of role in civil society and academia. So since like the mid 1970s, the influence of our intelligence services in academia has actually been a lot smaller. You know, the United Kingdom never had that kind of reckoning with its intelligence services. So as a result, it's very different. What
Oh,
happened here was a different process. So from the 1940s all the way through early 1990s, there was fairly generous government funding for studies of Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc, you know, just because there were a lot of people that wanted an objective understanding of what was going on in Eastern Europe. You know, the stakes were extremely high. It was, if we messed up, you know, there's going to be a nuclear war,
mm,
or we would fall to a communist revolution, or something else very, very unpleasant. So the result was we, you know, hired a lot of very high quality people. My great
mm,
uncle was one of them. He just sat in an office for I think 44 years, and he just translated just mountains and mountains of texts. You know, and there would be analysts who would read through these texts, and they would come up with theories for understanding the Soviet Union and the Second World more
mm.
broadly.
Oh,
This changed in the early 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. There's a huge cut in defense spending, and part of this cut in defense spending was there was a cut in academic research for spending for Second World studies, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. So these studies, which tended to be dominated by very intelligent people who were multilingual, who were very dedicated, who strove for objectivity, they had to lean into other sources of funding. One of the ways they could get this funding was, you know, and some very, very good academics leaned into this, was they could, you know, become popular historians. They could write for a popular mass audience, and they could research things that audiences were interested in. And in the United States, the thing that people are most interested in is World War II. It's an absolutely massive topic. Books on Hitler, Stalin, all their henchmen, Churchill, Roosevelt, they sell extremely well. There's historians who they've made a year's salary by writing a book on the logging industry in Wisconsin and how that played a role in the construction of light aircraft for D-Day specifically, like just this ultra niche topic. There's so much interest in World War II that this ultra niche topic can, sustain a historian for a whole year. So understandably, the historians, if they need to make a living, they need to pay for their wives and children or husbands, their vacations and all this stuff. So they go into popular history. And when they go into popular history, that means they're reading the old archives. They're not studying the new stuff. They're not studying what's going on in Russia in the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. And that does have something of a distortionate effect. The result is it's particularly prevalent in the Republican politicians, in the United States, is that they understand modern Russia and its relationship to Ukraine in the way that as if it's like 1934 and it's the middle of the famine in the Soviet period, where Stalin's henchman Kaganovich is brutally making sure that the grain quotas are being met by exporting, taking the food from the Ukrainian peasants and exporting it to the first world for hard currency that they can use to import industrial goods. So that's the understanding that a lot of Republican politicians, particularly older Republican politicians, have of Russia and Ukraine. There's I think there's a senator, he was one of the ones from Alabama or Mississippi. He basically said something along the lines of this is the second Holodomor. Putin is doing to Ukraine what Stalin was doing. Just completely misunderstanding the nature of the conflict.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, it's interesting. Larger issue. We're 80 years after World War II and still stuck in the concepts of World War II. So every time you talk peace, it's called appeasement. It's 1938 again, and if we don't stop him now, we'll stop him later. I mean, all these opponents of the West are nominated as little Hitlers, aren't they? And if they're not stopped today, they're going to be occupying the world. And it was used against I don't remember, obviously. I was young when in the 70s, but the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, it was the same tedious thing all over again. You got to. Who was the Hitler of the month? It was Milosevic, then it was Saddam, then it was the guy in Tripoli, Gaddafi, and then it was of course Putin, and and it's a very simplistic way of looking at war and peace, because most wars are negotiated and to peace, and everybody compromises. But this appeasement, the diminution of appeasement, means that diplomatic options are foreclosed because everyone thinks of Chamberlain waving his piece of paper. So the World War II has a deleterious effect on policy making, and it's interesting that you're saying that it's got even worse since 2000s because everybody's heading back into World War II and mining that for an income. And one thing that struck me, and you might know much more about the subject, it's just speculation on my part, but I mean, I've been interested in Russian affairs for 25, 30 years. And for a long while, there was something called Johnson's Russia list, which was an emailing list where before, the days of blogs and things where all the articles and people emailed each other, and it was a subscription list. And I thought, who are these people who subscribe to these lists? They're so anti-Russian, and it makes me wonder if the only people who stayed in Russian affairs after the Cold War were because people went on and found other ways to make money or other stories, the European Constitution in Europe, whatever, were the real Russophobes, the Russia holdouts. And they stayed long enough for Russia to become in the news again, and they've helped shape the stance on Russia. And some of them, you said you made money from history books. I wonder how many of them were being funded by, let's say, the Baltic governments or Ukrainian exiles and things like that to produce a very biased history. And the other thing I want to say, and I'm not really asking questions, I'm making statements, and you can pick up on them, is that the two loudest voices of the American academia and journalism are Anne Applebaum and Timothy Snyder. And Timothy Snyder is another one who learned who's written books about the interwar period, and he seems to think it's the interwar period all over again. And he's incredibly retarded, I think, for a Pulitzer Prize winning top historian. I think, my God, this man is so out of touch. And Applebaum is terrible. I mean, but she traveled around and she wrote. She's probably the go-to expert on Eastern Europe. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I agree. They're both very good examples of how the need to write about World War II really shaped a lot of people's perspectives. Just when you look at the sources of knowledge that are upstream of mass media and of politicians. There's a second factor which I think is underrated, though. So as a lot of the funding for Eastern Europe and the Second World were being cut in the early 1990s, the programs that remained, there were a lot of there was a different trend that was going on in academia at the time, and it was actually driven by various regulatory changes and legal shifts in the United States in the late 1970s, early 1980s. There was a law, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, and then there's the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972. And the acts as they were written were actually, quite reasonable. It just said you can't have racial discrimination in employment, which is perfectly reasonable. That's what the American people decided upon in the 1960s and early 1970s, and we created these apparati to implement it. So when these, apparati were created, they created these EEO officers, and they were within the personnel or human resources departments of universities, of corporations, government agencies, these sorts of things. And they were just supposed to be the ones who were trained in dealing with complaints about racial, sexual, ethnic, national, whatever discrimination, which is perfectly reasonable. The courts, though, we have an independent judiciary in the United States. It's quite different from the United Kingdom with parliamentary supremacy. We do have genuine separation of powers between our three branches of government. The judiciary went and it decided to interpret these two laws in an increasingly strange way in the 1970s and 1980s. And it decided that, the spirit of the law, so not even the text of the law, required that these EEO officers be granted like more and more power, that they actually have to be granted oversight, not just of the personnel or human resources office, but also of a lot of the administration and the executive functionings of, agencies. So in the universities, this started this whole administrative revolution where, previously the various groups of professors had dominated the boards of regents, these elected officials in the state governments who were, overseeing the governance of the universities. They became less and less powerful, and these various EEO officers and their additional staff became more and more powerful. So these EEO officers, they're not very intelligent people. They're not interested in truth. They're primarily interested in advancing whatever class they're a member of. So, the result of this is by the late 1980s and early 1990s, there's a lot of complaints from, mostly right wing, but also quite a few like hard left wing, like Marxist, like class reductionist type left wing thinkers that, we have all these identity based activists who are taking over the universities. And they just kind of they dismissed it as a phenomenon like the weather. They thought it was just a fad, that it would go away, and it was just complete nonsense. It was all downstream of various judicial decisions that the judiciary was imposing upon the universities, which was very much in violation of the spirit of these laws that were passed in the 1960s and 1970s. So the way this affected the area studies was these groups that were empowered by the judiciary as the result of these two laws. They they could more or less say, okay, if you don't give us what we want, we will say that you're being discriminatory, and we've been given power by the judiciary to, take more oversight over your specific academic program. So these various area studies programs, like not only are they hurting for money, they're being forced to focus on, the interests of, these certain classes, which have been given, a lot more power in the 1980s and early 1990s. This initially does not affect Eastern European studies, Central Asian studies, East Asian studies. It's primarily in American history at first, but eventually by the 2000s, with the rise of the LGBT movement, you do see it start to hit the Eastern European stuff as well. So by like the early 2010s, you actually have a decent amount of the studies in Eastern Europe, Russia, the former Soviet Union, are specifically about homosexuals. So you have, maybe like 3 or 4% of the population of the former Soviet Union is homosexual, depending on which surveys you use. But you have about a third of all academic studies are being done by, focused on LGBT people in the former Soviet Union. So this is why, like, when Putin becomes like a dictator truly after in 2012, when he decides to run for president again, in spiritual violation of the Russian Constitution, it's not that much of an outrage in, Western media. Like the Western media is getting all of its understanding of Russia and Eastern Europe from academia, and academia largely is not studying the changes in Russian government. Like one of the British academics, Richard Sakwa, he's one of the only people in English who's written about how Putin consolidated power, how he largely superseded the federal system with the creation of the federal districts in 2000 and kind of created the power vertical. A lot of that stuff did not get discussed in the United States. What was being researched and discussed was, the various feminist organizations, the absolutely minuscule black minority in Russia, the fates of
Pussy
various
Riot. Pussy Riot was were they
yes,
big,
yes,
weren't they?
Pussy Riot was very big. And then of course the LGBT movement.
Mm.
So the thing that really sets off a lot of stuff is not Putin becoming a dictator in 2012, but this anti-gay law that Russia passes in 2013, since you have all of these academics who are really, really unhappy about that.
Mm. Right, that makes sense. And there was a very well-known Masha Gessen was a lesbian, wasn't she? So she wrote a lot about that. Um, but I mean, apparently, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that homosexuality is actually legal in Russia, right? It's just that you can't promote it. And so I wonder, you probably know more than I do, that the stance towards gays is not very much different from the UK in the 1990s. I mean, it's much more in tune
That
with
is
Western
correct.
public opinion than with the radicals who now run our polities. So,
Yes, and that's one of the issues too, where, again, like genuine objective Russian studies are not done. There's not an understanding that there's like very open gay, pop stars and various figures, who don't suffer any persecution at all.
right. Not people don't know that, do they? I
No,
No,
mean,
they
it's
don't.
not known.
right. Yeah, Martin.
Yes, uh, you've been talking at great length and knowledge, obviously, about the sociological basis in academia for the shift in perception of Russia and failure to understand Russia. But from a Washington perspective, you must have seen repeatedly that this enormous animus against Slavs in general, Russians in particular, and there are other blank spots like total ignorance of the true history of Bulgaria, Slovakia, history of Belarus, the true and very dark histories of the Baltic states are never discussed at all. But I see this as part of a wider issue that foreign expertise in Washington, both in the media and in the political sphere, and certainly in the think tanks, uh, academia at its best is frozen out from this. And instead, we have very powerful anti-Russian lobbies. We have very powerful pro-Israel lobbies. We have very powerful pro-Saudi lobbies. We have and this reaches to the highest level. We've had we've had a national security advisor who dominated Democratic Party thinking on Russia for more than 40 years, and that was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I knew personally very well. And Zbig was admirable to deal with if you were Jewish, if you were Israeli, if you were Arab, if you were mainstream Sunni, uh, all the way. And he was, and if you were Polish too. But if you were Russian, he hated you like poison. This was a man who was not racist in American terms at all. He recommended to David Rockefeller, one of his most promising students, a young fellow at Columbia University in his international relations course called Barack Obama, of whom other things were later heard, that he had a great future in politics and should be supported, even at the highest level. So he was not an anti-black or anti-Semitic racist in the slightest. But when it came to Russia, I can personally testify that he was poison. And so was his disciple Madeleine Albright, who was Czech and was also of Jewish ethnic background, though she hid that obsessively. But they were just the tip of the iceberg. All these people from Eastern Europe who either went into politics or advised politicians or dominated the thinking in think tanks, both liberal and conservative. Did you? Can you comment on this? And did they freeze academia out, or did they come out of this new academia that was shaped by these new perceptions that you've been talking about?
No, they're the older generation of the Cold War experts. So the older, like Brzezinski and the others, they actually did understand Russia and the Soviet Union fairly well, even though they detested both of them. Um, it's different from this current generation of experts, which does not understand them, but still detests them, and for very separate reasons.
Well, in what ways? I mean, specify, how do they fail to understand Russia today? What are their misperceptions?
I mean, for the LGBT types that dominate the universities, they they see everything as kind of like an oppressor versus oppressed lens, and they see Russia as a totalitarian state rather than kind of a strange, partly authoritarian hybrid regime, with, prominent role for the intelligence services, but also like a lot of very real vestigial democratic structures. So they miss those aspects. They miss that Russian revanchism is nationally oriented rather than ideologically. Like they're not trying to do kind of a worldwide authoritarian revolution. They, just want to reclaim what they see as lost Russian lands. There's not really a threat to, Central Europe the way there was. It's really just to Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic.
Mm.
Um, there's a lot of misperceptions that Russia's poorer than it actually is. There's a misconception that the minority regions are oppressed rather than having, a limited amount of autonomy since 2000.
Mm.
There's definitely a misperception of the competence of the Russian intelligence services and its propaganda apparatus. Both neither of which is particularly threatening to the West, but both of which are, blown vastly out of proportion for the very limited efforts they do take.
Mm.
Now, as it happens, these are areas you've talked about in which I have a lot of familiarity and expertise myself. And my experience and observation is exactly the same as yours. I fully agree with you. But I find, like you do, this doesn't appear anywhere. Have you been called onto this, or when you try to point these things out, are you blocked? Does no one listen to you? What's your perception of this? Because clearly you have expertise on this. You have experience. Your experience is enormously relevant to policy making in the Congress and in the State Department today. Are there people who realize this? Do they reach out to you, or are you blocked from it, or they just don't know you're there?
I mean, I talk to anyone who wants to talk with me. That's why I'm on here today. Um, so I mostly just write whatever I find interesting.
Mm.
But are you reached out to? Are you invited to these conferences and seminars? Are you on their inner circuit?
No, I'm not.
Well, I would say you should be, but
Mm.
why are you not on their inner circuit?
There's a lot of different priorities for the administration, I think. They very much want Russia and Eastern Europe to go away and cease being their problem. Their primary interest is the Middle East for a variety of reasons.
Mm.
I agree with you. I'm not laughing dismissively towards you. You understand. I'm laughing dismissively in agreement with you and in despair.
Yeah. Well, I think
Sure.
that the British have a big role to play. I mean, I think that So I was just reading. I mean, there was Putin's 9th of May victory speech. Afterwards, he was blaming Macron and the British for working together, because the Russians, the Americans, and the West claimed that Russia had pulled out of Kiev because they were too weak to hold Kiev back in 2022. But they pulled out apparently because Macron said, "Well, the Ukrainians can't negotiate if they've got a pistol pointed at their head." So Putin pulled out. And then Boris Johnson went and told the Ukrainians that they'll be back to the hilt, don't make peace. So they'd coordinated that. So basically, they betrayed, I mean, the Ukrainians because they didn't back Ukraine to the hilt. Thank God, in a way, because otherwise we'd be enmeshed in a huge kinetic war. So it's all a total mess. But I mean, I think that the British were driving this perhaps even more than Biden, and I think that Trump doesn't want to get involved. Um, but I see, the British opinion is still totally anti-Russian, whereas I see there's some opening in America, some more openness. I don't know if it's only people like Tucker Carlson or if there's some opening in the Washington Post and so on. Maybe not. I don't know what you think.
I mean, the United States it's a very different political system from the United Kingdom. Uh, the issue with the United Kingdom is you guys have, quite substantial penetration of the intelligence services and, media and civil society. That goes back to what we were discussing earlier, where there was never like a reckoning for the abuses of the intelligence services
I
in the United
agree.
Kingdom
Yeah,
in the 1970s, the way there was in the other four or five eyes countries, from 1974 to 1979. Um, so when you guys like all your media, all your politicians, all your institutions are lockstep anti-Russia, that's in large part due to your intelligence services having like actual legal veto power over stories. Like they can have stories pulled, they can insert stories. It's We've been moving back in that direction since the second Bush administration as the result of the war on terror,
mm.
but we still do have a lot, like our institutions are far more independent of
Good.
the intelligence
Oh,
services than
it's good
yours
to
are.
hear that because I've got a lot of friends in the UK who blame everything on the United States. But I'm afraid we've got to end there because our 40 minutes are up, and otherwise it'll cut out automatically.